Hi everyone, this is Dr. Mike, host of the free iTunes podcast, Psychiatric Secrets Revealed with Dr. Mike, but that's not why I'm here today. This is another Saving Savvy episode. This time we're going to talk about finding the right ISO to use in your camera. So what is ISO? I guess the right way here. In the old days when we had film, we would call that the ASA or the film speed. In fact, I'll often refer to ISO as film speed, even though there is no film in the camera. It basically tells you how sensitive the sensor is to light. And obviously, the more sensitive the sensor is, or the more sensitive you make that sensor, you have the ability to take pictures in darker environments. So let's look at that for a moment. And this is the famous exposure triangle. Where are we here? So three things control proper exposure. The aperture, or how wide the lens is open. The wider the lens, the bigger the hole, the more light that comes in. The shutter speed, the longer the shutter is open, the more light that comes in. And the ISO, or the sensitivity. And ISO, when you double the ISO, you need half as much light. So in other words, if you go from an ISO of 100 to 200, you need half as much light to get a proper exposure. If you go from 200 to 400, you need half as much light. If you go from 400 to 800, you need half as much light. So it's a very important tool to have, and it's used in a variety of situations. But the most common way that a common typical photographer is going to use ISO is in a darker situation where you can't use your flash. So like taking maybe pictures in a museum, or I like taking ISO, high ISO pictures in the house where it's darker and I just don't want to use the flash. So what's the problem with that? Well, all sensors are kind of geared towards working most optimally around an ISO of 100 or 200. And in those situations, you have a lot of light, right? So you have a lot of light coming into the sensor, and the noise level, which is just naturally produced by the electronics on the sensor, is fairly low. When you're in a low light condition, even though you're boosting the ISO, in other words, you're turning up the gain or the volume on that sensor, you're not changing the sensor, you're just kind of turning up the amplification on it, the low light is a lot closer to the noise floor, and so you tend to see noise and degradation in pictures. So in a perfect world, most people would recommend that you would take your pictures at an ISO of 100 or 200 for any camera, but that's of course not possible. So let me tell you about a simple test that you can do. I have three cameras here. This is an older Nikon. This is a Nikon D3000, so an older DSLR. This is a enthusiast camera. I think this is the LX7, but it's a Panasonic enthusiast camera. It has a small sensor, but a little bit bigger than typical and better electronics. And here is a common point and shoot. This is just a Sony point and shoot camera that I bought a number of years ago at Walmart on a trip. It actually works pretty well. So we have three types of cameras, and all of those cameras allow you to do a couple of things. You can set the camera, and it's easiest to show on this one here, in program mode. You want to turn off the flash, so you don't want to use the flash. And you want to turn off anything that says auto ISO. What auto ISO will do is it will pick the optimal ISO for that particular setting, but we want to test the different ISOs, so we want to turn that off. And it's going to be different in each camera. In this one, for instance, if I turn it on and I go to, it says ISO sensitivity settings, I press OK. Down here it says auto ISO sensitivity, that's off. And then I can set my ISO up here on this camera just in the menu, or there's other ways to do it too, but just you could do it in that way. You'll have to look at your manual for your particular camera. So again, you're going to, let me use my little sheet here. So you're going to use the program mode, not the automatic mode, because program mode allows you to change the ISO. You're going to turn off the auto ISO or the intelligent ISO or whatever, so you can pick the ISO. You're going to take photos, and you're not going to use the flash because you want to see how the camera performs in low light, and you're going to take those photos in a setting that you normally would. So I usually take settings in the house because that's where I'm typically going to use the camera without the flash. And then you want to view the pictures on the computer because the screen is bigger and it's going to give you an idea of if the picture is usable or not. Now, when we say that, we're saying usability, it's usable, but not perfect. So what I mean by that is anytime you raise your ISO, even on a DSLR, the picture starts to degrade. But in many cases, that degradation isn't really very objectionable for the typical person. Maybe if you were publishing this on a magazine cover or something, it would be, but not so much if you're posting to Facebook. So you have to see what your own level is, and the range that the camera will give you isn't always a guide to how well it will perform in low light. So some cameras will say that they'll perform at 12,800 ISO, but the usable picture is more around 3,200 ISO. So even though the camera says that it performs that well, it really doesn't. And that usability has to be something that is your personal preference. So what I have done is I've looked at a lot of different cameras, and this is just really your mileage may vary kind of a thing. And definitely it may vary from camera to camera. But when I look at compact cameras, in general, and it depends on the camera, some will perform reasonably well at an ISO of 800. Some will even perform at an ISO of 1600. And maybe some beyond that too, but in the ones that I've tested, that's sort of the range. When I look at a hobby or enthusiast camera like this Panasonic, and this would also include things like a G16, that's a Canon camera, or a I have a 7700, but I think there's a 7800, that's a Nikon camera. These are expensive enthusiast cameras with slightly larger sensors than in a compact camera. Expect to get a performance that goes from about an ISO of 3200 or a little below to, even with some cameras, an ISO that's acceptable of 6400. With a large sensor camera, we're talking about a Micro Four Thirds or a APS-C camera that's like a DSLR or a full frame camera. Expect to get reasonable pictures ranging from an ISO of 3200 to 12,800. Those are the top limits. Again, you always want to use the lowest ISO possible, usually 100 or 200. Now the reason I'm using this particular camera, this D3000, it's an older camera, and I would say its usable ISO is up to 3200, really looks better around 1600. But if I brought out a DF, you would say, well, that's the new Nikon camera that uses a great full frame sensor. I think you can get some usable pictures at 12,800. Now again, usable means it may have some noise. The picture may be a little more smeary. It won't be as crisp because the internal features of the camera will try to reduce noise by smearing things down a little bit. But it's all about what you find usable. Now, the last thing that I would say about this is when you're using ISO, obviously, or when you're not using a flash, you get a much more natural looking picture, and it just looks better, I think, in many instances because it really reveals the scene. But to do that, you'll have to have some film degradation. So what do you do if you really need to take a picture and you're at your top usable ISO and you're really kind of stuck, or you have to even push it past a little bit? So let's say your camera will go past what you consider an acceptable ISO. You have to maybe push past one stop that acceptable ISO just to get the right exposure. There's a couple of things that you can do. One thing is you can fool around with the noise settings on the camera. Most cameras will allow you, especially a better camera, to adjust how much noise reduction is put into the picture. Find out a level that maybe is acceptable for you. Unfortunately, the higher you go, the more fake the picture looks. It looks more like a poster. The other thing that you can do is to convert the picture into a black and white picture or a sepia picture, that kind of masks some of the noise and makes the picture look more acceptable. And a third thing that you can do is that you can actually take the picture, and in a camera it will allow you to take, let's say, a large or medium or small size picture. Well, large is always best in most situations because you have the most data. But if you go to a medium picture, you will actually mask some of the noise. So let's say on a camera like this is a 10 megapixel camera. I'm guessing that the medium is probably around 7 or maybe 5 megapixels. If I go to a medium picture, it'll just look less noisy, and I'll be able to post it or do whatever I want to it. So those are the hints that I would give you on your camera. Again, don't just rely on what it says, even in a report, because a lot of times those are under certain conditions. If I take a picture in a high ISO in brighter light, it's going to look a lot nicer than if I take one in a real situation, like at a party or something. So do the test, see where your ISO lies, try to stay within that range using the lowest ISO possible, and when that doesn't work, try a few of the tricks that I've just given you, and happy shooting, and have a wonderful day. And if you have some time, please give my podcast a listen. It's called Psychiatric Secrets Revealed with Dr. Mike. You can find it on iTunes and other podcasting venues. Take care.